Okay, so let me introduce our guest. So first of all, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And let me briefly introduce our guest for today. He is Cameron Martel is a third-year PhD student at MIT Sloan School of Management. Am I right? So
a fourth year now.
Oh, fourth year. So, yeah,
I got to update that website.
So I have to, you have to update it.
That's me.
So he's interested in cognitive processes underlying the belief and spread of misinformation, and his research examines the efficacy of different interventions in quelling dissemination of false information. And I believe that today's talk is going to regard that, right? So the efficacy of fact-checking, warning labels, also about on people who distrust fact-checkers, right?
That's right.
Yeah, okay, so now I'm going to leave it to you, Cameron. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to talk. I'm really
nice background, by the
way. Thank you. And yeah, really excited to talk about some ongoing work done by myself and in collaboration with Dave Rand at MIT, who's my advisor. And perhaps the audience here doesn't need too much introduction about there being a lot of concern about the spread of misinformation online, and this can be about really important topics such as elections or vaccinations, other political and health issues. And it's important as a result for researchers, practitioners to think about different, not only why people believe such misinformation, but also interventions that can perhaps reduce the belief in or spread of such false claims and rumors. So it's been proposed to assess a lot of different potential avenues for dealing with this problem. I like the idea of trying to think of different individual interventions and ways to combine them throughout different steps of the process. And just to hone in a little bit, suppose that we take someone who comes across some misinformation online. Before this, during this, and after this, there's steps where you can take content-specific approaches. Of course, there are perhaps content-agnostic approaches like digital literacy trainings, accuracy prompts, etc. What I'm going to be talking about are just content-specific ones that depend on some evaluation of specific claims. And I think it's useful to think about this in several steps. So before someone is exposed to content, and perhaps this group doesn't need too much background on this, you can pre-bunk certain claims, you can inoculate people in various ways by exposing them to weakened forms of the argument. Twitter, for example, did this by when you logged on during the 2020 election in the United States, telling people that they might encounter certain specific false claims about voting fraud or disputed election results in their feed. So that would all happen before people see the claim. And then after the claim, there's, of course, abundance of work on debunking and corrections. These have been shown to be widely effective, very little risk of backfire. These can be social corrections from other people. They can be professional corrections from fact checkers. These are all after someone has been exposed to the claim. Just to plug some of my own work briefly, we've also done this in some online, formerly Twitter field experiments, where we actually found people that posted misinformation and corrected them through bot accounts that we set up, and happy to talk about that more later if you'd like. What I'm going to be focusing on during this talk is what happens concurrent with exposure to the content, and specifically with warning labels like this one that you see here. And recently, Dave Rand and I put out a review in the Current Opinion in Psychology, just summarizing some of the literature on warning labels. There's less of this than there is on corrections, let's say, but I think it's a really important thing to focus on because it's one of the main standards of care that current social media platforms use when dealing with misinformation. And also the results so far seem pretty good, and I'll talk more about that in a sec. So again, one approach for reducing the belief and spread of misinformation is flagging or putting warning labels on false news, and this is concurrent with false news exposure. And these are just some examples here of what that could look like. We have the false information overlay. This is the one currently used by Facebook. Twitter will attach smaller little tags underneath articles saying that a thing might be misleading or providing more information. And you can also imagine hyper stylized versions of labels, however you see fit. As I mentioned, this is part of the current standard of care, along with demoting or downranking in the feed articles that third-party fact checkers partnering with organizations have decided are false. And this is done on Facebook. This was the older tag that they used before they switched to the new overlay. This is Instagram using something very similar to the Facebook overlay, which makes sense. And Twitter's smaller tags, and sometimes blocking through like an interstitial block that you need to click through depending on the severity of the content. There's also a very important question of who is doing this labeling, where are the decisions coming from? I think that's very important to think about. And currently, what these platforms do, at least, is partner with third-party fact-checking programs such as Snopes, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, etc. And they're sending out content that is flagged either by users or by any internal content moderation algorithm. They'll send these to fact checkers, and then unfortunately it takes about 3 to 4 days to get a fact check back, and then eventually they'll get or to do a fact check once fact checkers have decided to even begin fact checking that claim. So it can be a kind of slow process, but once that adjudication returns, they can label false content and demote it. Of course, that's up to the platform to enforce, which is another issue. But that's how the current standard of flagging works. And I'll also say that labels can come from other sources as well. Some of my other work looks at crowdsourced fact checking. If we can enlist layperson users on social media platforms, especially ones that have a lot of users, to kind of do this flagging, do some kind of moderation itself. And this is also being used to a lesser extent by platforms. Facebook, for example, has community review where they pay lay people to review certain articles just to scale up their fact-checking efforts. And Twitter has community notes, which enables users to, once they see a tweet that they think is misleading, write a free response fact check. If that gets enough cross-cutting upvotes from people that normally disagree with them, that can be surfaced as like an additional context note underneath. So these are some other approaches. And on this vein with crowdsourced fact checking, I won't be focusing on this today, but also happy in the Q&A to talk about some other projects of mine. One is on community notes, or like an opt-in community fact checking system, where essentially the TLDR is you need partisan motives to be in this system to get enough flags to sustain this fact-checking endeavor, and that accuracy motivation can work in combination with such partisan motives. And also have some work on increasing the legitimacy perceptions of crowds relative to experts, and what you can do to make people like more confident that these crowds might be producing good decisions. Great. But today I'm going to be focusing on the labeling that's currently being done by social media platforms. I'll be using studies that use this false information to check by independent fact checkers overlay. And so like these are some of the independent fact checkers, for instance, that Facebook and other companies are working with to produce these labels. And as I mentioned in my review, there is previous work that looks at labeling as a potential intervention. For example, Porter and Wood have a paper in which they use something very similar to their false information overlay, and they see on average pretty robust and moderately sized effects on decreasing belief. Similar findings have used the older Facebook tag on sharing. And there are some differences by the style or design of the label as well. For example, it might make sense that labels that are easier to see and bigger generally work better. This is showing how an interstitial label that you need to click through wound up having better effects on belief in or disbelief in COVID misinformation in a Twitter format. So if it's the case that these warning labels are working well on average in prior research, then perhaps there's not much left to do here. We know that warning labels are great. We don't need to worry too much. However, there are substantial concerns, both from researchers and also that we've heard from practitioners, on if the warning labels are affecting the people that they care about affecting, or if they may even be potentially harmful to certain subgroups. Who are these subgroups? Well, a lot of reporting has gone into showing that people on the political right and Republicans, as well as across the political spectrum, in some cases, distrust fact checkers. They don't trust them to fact check accurately. They think that they're biased. This is also shown in some work by Brendan Nyhan from several years ago now. And all of this goes to maybe lead us to the idea that perhaps some people don't want or won't trust or won't be affected by warning labels that come from independent third-party fact checkers, which is a real issue if that is one of the cornerstones of the standard of care that these companies are relying on. Now, I mentioned backfire effects potentially. These are, again, pretty rare in corrections. However, there has been raised some concerns, again, in the correction literature that maybe we should really look at heterogeneity across certain subgroups just to make sure or see what's happening across this. I think this is particularly important for Republicans in the US and for individuals on the political right, since a lot of work has shown that they're exposed to and sharing misinformation disproportionately in the field. So, warning labels from these fact checkers might be effective on average and in aggregate, but they might be less effective for some types of people that are really important, that we care about. So what I'm going to try and answer today is the question, are fact checks effective even for those who say that they distrust fact checkers? Because this might be particularly a problem group for this intervention that we want to make sure that these warning labels are working on, and to what extent. So a quick roadmap for what I'll be talking about. First, I will discuss a correlational validation study. The first thing that we're going to do is come up with a measure of trust in fact checkers. We're going to ask if people say that they trust fact checkers, and we're going to try to validate that against a more behavioral measure of choice in seeing fact checks to begin with. And also do some exploration of who says that they trust fact checkers, who doesn't, what might be moderating these relationships. And then I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of warning label experiments in which we're going to ask, one, do we replicate prior work and show that warning labels are working? Just, on average, are they decreasing belief in and sharing of misinformation? And then does trust in fact checkers moderate this warning effect on accuracy or on sharing? And also, are warning labels effective even for those who distrust fact checkers? So that first part is saying oh, is there a difference in that effect? The second part is the difference to the extent where for the most extremely distrusting people, is the effect not even there anymore? So we'll start with the correlational validation study. We ran this with 1,000 people on Lucid. These were quota matched on American demographics. And we filtered for social media users only. So you had to say that you had a Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram account to participate in the survey. We also do some trivial attention checks and filtering on the front end before the survey began. To measure trust in fact checkers, and the main point of this was to validate a scale. What we do is we modify a trust in media scale from Sosfati and Capella. And this has questions such as how much of the time do you think you can trust political fact checkers to fact check the news fairly? Or all in all, how would you rate the job professional fact checkers have done fact checking COVID news so far? We asked the same for political news, and it's various questions along these lines. And fortunately, we find first high internal reliability of the scale, which was a good start. But more importantly, we wanted to check some kind of external validity as well. So we examined the relationship between self-reported trust using that scale with choosing to actually see fact checks. And so we asked participants, would you like to view professional fact checker warning labels on headlines which have been written false by professional fact checkers in a news task that they would then be exposed to? And if you said yes, then you saw a headline or two that when it was false had a label. And if you said no, you did not see those labels. So it was credible. And we find a pretty big difference in the actual trust in fact checkers of people who said yes and no, which gives us some more confidence that the people that are self-reporting negative attitudes or distrust in fact checkers are actually have these preferences as well. So who trusts fact checkers? Who doesn't? A lot of the reporting and some research suggests that we should expect those on the political right and Republicans to be relatively less trusting. Here we have partisanship on the 1 to 6 scale on the x-axis, and trust in fact checkers scaled 0 to 1 on the y. And we find that Democrats have relatively high trust in fact checkers, and this is lower for Republicans. Then we look at if this relationship and this partisan difference is perhaps moderated by various individual differences factors that we were interested in. Procedural news knowledge, CRT, and web use skill, which are these quadrants here, are all essentially quiz measures. They have right answers to them. Procedural news knowledge asks items like, Google News do its own reporting, or is it an aggregator? And different questions about like what the lead of an article is. For example, the cognitive reflection test is the Batten law problem, and a measure of analytic thinking and related items as well. A web use skill is a short questionnaire on things like which of these passwords is the most secure, what's a QR code, kind of like a skills-based measure of digital literacy. And we see for each of these an interesting increasing divergence in trust in fact checkers by partisanship, such that the more higher news knowledge, more analytic, and greater web use skill Republicans are even more distrusting of fact checkers relative to Democrats as you increase on those skills measures. Interesting, we don't see this for this last one, which is digital media literacy using a scale by Guess and Munger. This is importantly not a skills measure. This is a self-report measure. We just see essentially no moderation there, and increasing trust in fact checkers as you increase in self-reported digital media literacy.
Sorry, Cameron, I have a question.
Yeah, I should say, feel free to jump in with clarification.
I'm not seeing any, so that's why I'm jumping in. So on the previous slide, you show that, if I understand the graph correctly, about the one about the this one, it seems that, I mean, for Republicans, there's a slight advantage on the extreme. So like people on 6, there are more extreme that tend, like on average, to trust like slightly more. Is that right?
Yeah, so this difference here is not significant.
Yeah, of course. And then on graph, like 1 is very Democrat, right?
Right, that's right.
Yeah. And then on the next slide, there's a sort of you show that the Republicans, like the less they are how to say, like skilled in sort of technology use, and the more they trust. So could it be like an effect of age, that the hardcore Republicans are older and they don't know how to use these kind of things? I don't know.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, it could be. In our next analyses and in the experiment, we always look at we include age as a covariate that we're into, but I haven't looked at age, the relationship between age and trust in fact checkers. So that's definitely something I'll do. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Great. And I'll also actually, we're about to be at a good pausing place, so I will do one more slide. And here we looked at this is not using our 8-item scale. This is using just a different measure of trust in each of these individual fact-checking organizations, because we had some thoughts that maybe some of these, such as Snopes or the Washington Post fact checker, would be more perhaps polarizing in terms of trust between Democrats and Republicans, as Snopes and Washington Post are at least reportedly perceived as having a left lean by many Republicans. So first, for these like more mainstream, more perceived as left-leaning organizations, we see these big differences in trust between Democrats and Republicans. The next ones that we look at, Real Clear Politics and the Dispatch, are ostensibly right-leaning fact-checking organizations. So we expected maybe this difference to decrease a little bit. We don't see this. We see a very similar gap between Democrats and Republicans in trust. The last two, we actually just made up some fact-checking organizations. They probably shouldn't have trusted these as they are not real. But we also see this gap here as well. So it seems pretty across the board for these organizations that there is this big difference in trust between Democrats and Republicans. So just to recap, that first initial validation study, we start with this 8-item validated measure of trust and fact checkers. We see that it correlates well with actual choice for seeing fact checks. We find, as expected, that Democrats and people on the political left are higher in trust and fact checkers than Republicans. And we see that this partisan gap in trust is increasing with greater news knowledge, cognitive reflection, and digital ability. And this seems to be mostly driven by lower trust in Republicans who are higher in these different skills measures. So I'll pause there for a second if anyone has quick questions that they want to discuss before I go into the experiments part. Wonderful. So next, I'll be talking about a bunch of different warning label experiments. So that was all great. We have a measure of trust and fact checkers now, but now we want to actually test out if fact checker warning labels are effective and for who. And just as a reminder, we're really interested in if this trust and fact checker is going to moderate this effect, and if it does, if the effect is still going to be there for people who really distrust fact checkers. So I'm going to first describe the general experimental paradigm that we use, and we have a real embarrassment of riches of experiments that we do this across. We have 21 experiments that are across, I believe, 8 different platforms, survey recruitment platforms, in which we do essentially this experiment. So people are going to start with the trust and fact checker scale that I previously showed you from the correlational study. Then for the main task, participants are told to post on social media, and then for each headline that you're going to see, evaluate either accuracy or sharing. So these were separate studies, and half the studies, the dependent variable was accuracy, the other half, the dependent variable was sharing intention. In the control condition, participants were told that they would not be shown any fact-checking information about any of the headlines that they were going to see. They then saw some number of headlines. I'll show you the details exactly. Usually it was like between 12 and 24. And these were always subsampled from a larger set of at least 100 total headlines, just to give us some more variability in the stimuli that people were seeing. And everyone saw an even split of true and false. So it was a 50-50 news feed on veracity and an equal split on pro-Democrat and pro-Republican stories as evaluated via pretesting. Sometimes there were also politically neutral stories thrown in, and in that case, it was also evenly split between the three. And again, the main task is they were told to, they're going to see this feed of stimuli, and then for each headline, they're going to evaluate either accuracy or sharing. In the warning treatment, participants were told that some percent of headlines were fact-checked, and if a headline was fact-checked and decided to be false by fact-checkers, then it would be labeled false, and they'd see a label on that. And these proportions, I'll show you which go to which study, but we're generally either 2/3 or 75%, one of them labeled every single headline, and this depended on the experiment. So in all cases, the majority were labeled. In most cases, in all but one, some false headlines were not labeled. Again, participants saw some number of headlines from these greater sets. Again, these were balanced on veracity and partisan lean. And importantly, the warning labels were also balanced across political lean. So for each subcategory, the same percentage of that type of headline of, like, let's say, true Democrat headlines were not true. No, there were no true labels, but the same percentage of false Republican headlines were labeled as false Democrat headlines. And just to be very clear, this is essentially what participants were seeing. In the accuracy experiments, they were asked to evaluate accuracy 1 to 6. And in the sharing experiments, they were asked to evaluate sharing likelihood 1 to 6. And this is what the false information label overlay would look like for the participants when it was on a headline. Wonderful. So again, we had 2 different kind of streams of experiments that were being run simultaneously on these recruitment platforms, but analyzed separately, accuracy and sharing outcomes. We had 2 sets of surveys where the main task of the survey was this headline evaluation. This was like basically what the survey was about. In these, people saw 24 headlines selected from a set of 140. These were conducted on Lucid and had the largest sample size, and 75% of content was false content was labeled in the treatment condition. Then a colleague of mine has been conducting multi-platform comparison studies across many different survey recruitment platforms. Unfortunately, my experiment was embedded as part of this. So just a caveat, there are other parts of the survey that participants had to do. So this is one of many components. And in this one, the participants saw 12 news items selected from 108. And this 108 is a subset of the 140 before. So it's actually the same item set. And in these, there were no neutral headlines. And here we have a whole bunch of different recruitment platforms with varying sample sizes. And here, 2/3 participants were told 2/3 of the false headlines in the treatment were going to be labeled. And finally, there is this additional like a timing study, which had 36 news items, dem rep. Here, all of the false labels in the treatment, all of the false news in the treatment were labeled. And this was conducted on Amazon Mechanical Turk. Essentially, we were able to throw in our fact checker scale into this survey as well and include it in these analyses. So overall, we have about 14,000 people total, 7,000 and 6,000 in each dependent variable outcome set of experiments. The main analysis that we conduct for each of these individual experiments is we're going to predict our DV, so either accuracy or sharing by a leveled factor for headline condition, where the baseline is going to be belief or sharing of the control false. And then the different levels that we're going to look at are false in the treatment when it has a label. That's going to be the warning effect. False in the treatment when it doesn't have a label, which I'll talk about a little bit later. True in the treatment and true in the control. And we're going to interact this crucially with trust and fact checkers, and also a bunch of demographic control variables that we pre-registered for including in all of these analyses. And we do two-way cluster robust standard errors for headline item and participants, since it's multiple people seeing multiple headlines and each headline getting rated by multiple people. Then we're going to do a random effects meta-analysis on our key values of interest. So the warning effects, so that's just the main effect of the false treatment when it is tagged relative to the false control. And also the warning effect is moderated by trust and fact checkers, which is the interaction between that warning effect and the Z-score trust and fact checkers moderator. First, I'm going to go through the accuracy experiment results and what we find. And here is going to be a forest plot of that accuracy effect across these different studies. And what we find, very concurrent with prior work and perhaps very optimistically, is a moderate sizable effective warning labels on false headlines relative to false headline belief in the control. So we find that warning labels are decreasing the perceived accuracy of labeled false headlines by about 9 percentage points. And this is about a 28% reduction in belief relative to baseline. So to put that in context, it's bigger than effect sizes that you might see from like accuracy prompts and about on par with some of the effect sizes reported for like digital media literacy tips. And it is a pretty good effect size. Now, crucially, we're going to look at moderation of warning effect by trust and fact checkers. And what we find here is a small but significant interaction, such that warning labels were slightly more effective at reducing belief in the labeled false headlines for individuals with greater trust in fact checkers. So this is in the direction that you might expect. It's not that big, but it is significant and there. So the next question that we want to ask is, okay, we see this moderation effect. Does this mean that the warning effect goes away, or perhaps even worst case scenario backfires for the least trusting people? So the first thing that we do to look at this is we look at the lowest quartile of individuals in trust and fact checkers. We're subsetting on this group. And here we find that we still find a warning effect. So warning labels are still decreasing the belief in these false headlines by 6 percentage points, about a 20% reduction relative to baseline, even for this sample. And then the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to do our main analysis, except instead of z-scoring trusted fact checkers, we're going to baseline it at 0. So this is the warning effect for the maximally distrusting participants in fact checkers. And even for these maximally distrusting individuals, we find this 4 percentage point reduction and a significant labeling effect. So this is very optimistic. This shows that for accuracy, even for these really distrusting folks of fact checkers, we're still seeing this persistent warning label effect, despite there being that moderation. And just to plot this out a bit, what I'm going to show here is on the y-axis, the warning effect is scaled 0 to 1. And on the x-axis, we have trusted fact checkers. The intercept over here is going to be that trusted fact checkers equal to 0 point. And what I did was for each decile of trusted fact checkers, conducted our main analysis absent trusted fact checkers as a moderator in the model. And then the slope here is that moderation effect, the meta-analytic of the estimate of the moderation effect. And so we do see that moderation, but crucially, if you're worried about these people, we're still seeing a warning effect, albeit a bit smaller here, and definitely no evidence of any backfire. In fact, all of these are still significant warning effects. So that was for accuracy, very optimistic. And for sharing, as a little preview, we see essentially the same thing. So for warning effects on sharing overall, we get a 6 percentage point reduction, so about a 25% reduce in intention to share labeled false headlines relative to the control. In terms of a moderation, we actually don't find significant moderation, but it's trending in that direction. We do some exploratory analyses where we compare for each study the effects for accuracy and sharing in like a paired model. What we find there is that the overall warning effect is significantly bigger for accuracy than for sharing. The moderation effect, there's no significant difference. So I would interpret this as evidence of there probably being a similar small moderation as in the accuracy here, or perhaps we're just underpowered to find this very small effect, even though we have so many studies. But again, perhaps some good news and evidence that these warning effects might still work for those distrusting fact checkers for sharing. Again, we look at the lowest quartile of trust and fact checker individuals and find very similar results, so 5 percentage point reduction in belief, and do the same thing for even the lowest and find this 3 percentage point reduction as well. And it's still significant. I'll show you a very similar plot as I did for accuracy. Again, this time we're looking at the warning effect on sharing intentions. And what we find is less of this moderation and still significant effects across the board. And most importantly, no backfire effects, nothing up here. Even for these low trust and fact checker individuals that we're most concerned about. So to summarize that main part of the talk, overall, we're finding minimal evidence that trust and fact checkers is substantively moderating fact check efficacy. We do see a statistically significant moderation with accuracy as a dependent variable. We don't find this for sharing, but overall, and more importantly, warning labels are decreasing the belief in sharing of misinformation, even for those who are the most distrusting of fact checkers. And some other interesting bits here are we note that this is perhaps an example of an attitude behavior gap where people are saying that they distrust fact checkers, but once they're actually faced with the individual content, they are updating in the direction of the warning label provided, even from when it's from a source that they don't necessarily trust. So, yes, I see a question.
Yes, exactly. Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
I recognize the name. I'm sure we've been on emails together.
Yeah. Super cool. Nice to put a face with the name. I have a few questions.
Yeah.
So first, can you talk about how you're thinking about the issue of experimental demand? So it seems like a high demand context where you tell me this is false according to non-partisan fact checkers, and then you say, how accurate do you think it is? And if I'm trying to be a good participant, even if I'm the kind of person that generally doesn't believe fact checkers, in the context of the experiment, I'm going to be a good participant and say I don't believe it. But maybe my beliefs haven't really changed. I was wondering if you thought of I don't know, using like an incentivized belief elicitation paradigm, or just how you're thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think for any of these misinformation tasks, that's something to consider. The reason why we generally don't use an incentivized paradigm is actually to get at that demand issue. The concern that we as a research group have about incentivizing is then there's even more of a reason to say what you think that the experimenter wants, so that you get paid for what they think is the right answer, even if you disagree with it. So that's one reason why we don't. I think it could be plausible that there are some that the effect might be increased by that to some extent. I also think that evident that the warning effect isn't 100% or like even anywhere reasonably close to that, even though we're literally telling people that the thing is false, shows some pretty good evidence that a lot of people, and more so people that say that they distrust the source and distrust the fact checker, which means hopefully they're even reading the label, are still saying that the thing is true, even when it is false right in front of them. And it might be even less of a concern for the sharing, where we see very similar results, where you might still want to share a thing, even if it has a false label on it, because it's interesting, it's funny. Other people that in your network might not believe the label. So there's some of my thoughts about that. But I know there's some recent work that looks at incentivizing and promoting accuracy and find that it increases accuracy. But again, my concern there is just if people are trying to match the researcher.
Yeah, it's a good point. The other thing, as long as I have you, that I wanted to ask about is you varied the percentage of stories that have ostensibly been fact checked, and I'm wondering, first, did you see any results? Did that variation matter? And second, how did you pick those percentages, because they seem substantially higher than what you would find in the real world?
Right. Good question. So unfortunately, based on the limited variation and also variation across other features of the studies, we thought that it wouldn't be a great comparison to look across the different 66 to 75% groups. Right now, we're designing some studies that are going to vary the percentage. I think something else that maybe even more important than the percentage is the fact that we did politically balanced labeling. And you could imagine that these results could be different if you're seeing only labels on stuff that's politically concordant, for example. It could be updating your trusted fact checkers maybe in real time to an extent that is interfering. So I think that's an important caveat here to note. But right now we are interested in that, and I will maybe have time to get to just like 2 extra slides I had on an implied truth effect, which is something that we're interested in, where we very much care about looking at that change in percentage label. And then the second question was about how we chose the numbers that we chose. Right. We wanted to, yes, it's definitely higher in some sense than the amount of content that's labeled, because there are many gaps and because of the slow amount of the slow rate of fact checking. On the other hand, the feeds that people are seeing are half false, which is a way higher false percentage than most people see in their news diet. So our the idea here was perhaps to really get an estimate of these warning effects, just to have enough signal and enough power to show we wanted a pretty high percentage. We didn't want to have it be 100% because we wanted it, one, to be a bit more of a challenging task than that, and two, to look at what happens when you leave some of the false claims unlabeled. But I as I said, we're working on a study now where we're going to try and vary the percentage of labeling, so I can get back to you on what we find there.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I see other hands up. Luke has a question.
Hello, yeah, I was just wondering about whether or not there's primacy effects of the warning labels. So whether or not, as you showed with Facebook and Instagram, the warning label shows up before the exposure to the misinformation, and whether or not seeing the warning prior to the misinformation, or if the warning label is below the misinformation, would affect a change in belief.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So what we do here is always an overlay that is entirely concurrent with it. There's a paper by Nadia Brashear, Dave Rand, and others that looks at the timing of essentially labels I know there was some argument about whether it constituted pre-bunking or not, but essentially what they did in that was they had like a true or a false label, and it was either shown that the thing was going to be false, and then they show the headline, that the headline was next to the false label, or that you had that after. What they find there, if I recall correctly, is that most effective was showing it right after, in terms of recall subsequently, and then I think a 2-week exposure period later. And that they also find a similar effect for showing it concurrently, and it was slightly weaker when you showed it right before. So I would point towards that paper. Here we only do the concurrent, and we're interested in that. But also I will say some similar work has looked at like the old Facebook tag, which came like right underneath. And though that generally had smaller effects, and just anecdotally, participants in those surveys sometimes even noted that they like didn't really notice the labels until like later in the survey, or didn't see them. And I think this is concordant with work that like the interstitial labels, like the more obtrusive that you have it, you know, are probably going to work better and have bigger effect sizes.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you.
And also a question from Costas.
Yeah, hi Cameron,
Hi.
how are you?
Hi, good. How are you doing?
Nice to see you, and very
Good to
nice
see
talk.
you. Thank you.
So I have a couple of comments, questions. So I found very interesting the result that you mentioned about the Republicans having like higher literacy, diverging more from the Democrats, right? The
Yes.
two. And this is very relevant to this motivated reasoning account, right? Where you find people who are highly educated to be better able to tell the stories they want to tell, kind of. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you have done this kind of discussion in this paper, but I think it's very relevant.
Sure. So yes, it is in line with like the Daniel Kahan kind of framework of like that divergence. What I will say to that is other colleagues of mine like Ben Tappan have some papers that look at you know, when exactly we can or can't tease apart like a motivated reasoning versus an accuracy based reasoning, if we are unsure of what the priors that people have are. So for example, it could be the case that you know, the information exposure of these people are different. They might be updating in a way that you know, isn't necessarily motivated reasoning, but a difference in the information that Republicans are getting, different source cues. I think a lot of why I mean, most people probably don't what was it? I think about 50% of Americans from a survey in like 2018 or 2019 reported seeing any fact-checking labels, and we did check if people knew who, like, what fact checkers were. If we, like, over 80%, 85% like knew what their job was, basically. But most people, I think, don't see fact checks or interact with fact checkers on a daily basis. I think a lot of the distrust is from like elite cues. So it could be a motivated account. It could be that, you know, these higher skilled in various ways Republicans are updating concordant to their priors because of the information that they're acquiring. It's just hard to tease that apart, but I do think that it's in line with that that pattern of results that's in the Kahanian work. So that's all I say.
Yeah, it's a pickle. It's a pickle to disentangle these two, for sure.
Exactly.
And then one comment is that signal detection theory would be a very interesting type of analysis that you could do related to Daniel's comment, right? To see the two types of error and whether people do some kind of adjustment for this. And then the last thing I wanted to discuss, and I wanted your opinion on this, because you mentioned two dependent variables, right? Very specifically, accuracy and sharing intention.
Yes.
And I saw a talk by a collaborator of Van Bavel, who was discussing a mega study that they ran recently on climate change attitudes. And she was saying that they basically tested 4 dependent variables in 60 countries with 11 interventions, right? Sure. So huge kind of project. And she was saying that the effects that they saw were completely different for the different variables. So the sharing intention had different effects than the behavior. And I wanted your opinion on are we actually checking the right dependent variables? Should we try to find different dependent variables to like complement what we're doing here?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good question. The reason why we focused on accuracy and sharing, accuracy, I think makes sense as a first order thing to check, especially because the warning label is about accuracy of the specific claim. Sharing, we cared about because of we wanted to make sure that these labels were also reducing the spread of the content as well. You could imagine that like maybe even if people disbelieve it, they could still be like disseminating it or not thinking about the accuracy, sharing it. A lot of work from collaborators of mine look at kind of where there's a gap between sharing intentions and accuracy. And that's like the whole motivation for like the accuracy prompt literature is people say they want to share accurate content, but oftentimes when they're doing sharing, accuracy isn't the thing that they're attending to. There's lots of other things like how interesting it is, how many retweets they're going to get on it. So prompting that can like close that gap a bit, right? But in terms of other outcome variables that we care about, I think that's a great question. I think to really know, I mean, I can contextualize the impact of these warning effects by percentage point reductions or like percent decreases. I think what really matters at the end of the day are outcomes like people's beliefs about like or attitudes or actual behaviors downstream from this. So there's work showing that these warning labels or corrections can be kind of limited in scope and what they're affecting. For example, like you might now disbelieve that a specific claim about election fraud, like, oh, like those postal workers and it dumped those ballots, but maybe you still think that there's widespread voter fraud. So I think those are all important things to look at downstream. But I think that these individual effects on specific claims can add up to those later beliefs. So maybe in a survey context, or you won't see these effects as some people haven't. But I think it's a good starting point just to validate if these interventions are at least working on this micro scale of belief in and dissemination of these individual claims, which I think that can add up over time as informational campaigns that do influence these later behaviors to some extent. But I think thinking more about harm, more about harm, and more about behaviors that can be harmful as a downstream consequence is something that is really important to think about for like misinformation as a field and for any kind of communications assessment. So that's a great question. And with the signal detection comment, one thing I'll say is the warning labels had normally we look at discernment between true and false. Since our intervention was targeted for false, we just looked at effect on false, and essentially we don't see any treatment effects on true claims. So a lot of these are going to be basically the same if you look at that difference. But I think doing a signal detection framework would be very interesting here as well. So thank you. Yeah, great question.
Thanks.
I will try and very quickly squeeze in like 2 minutes, just some quick bonus content, which is what about partisanship moderation? You might be wondering, like, what if instead of trusted fact checkers, we just look at partisans? We see really similar results, which makes sense because of the high association between partisanship and trusted fact checkers. So these are for the maximally Republican or conservative participants. We still see a warning effect of a 6 percentage point reduction in accuracy and a 6% percentage point reduction in sharing. And then I mentioned quickly an implied truth effect. And this is, there's only one paper really that's come out about this, but it's gotten a lot of buzz and people in tech companies have been concerned about this, like not a direct, but kind of like an indirect backfire as a result, as I discussed before, of like the limitations of the coverage of labels. And so briefly, in the control, you have control false. In the treatment, you have labeled false, but you also have these unlabeled false, right? So if you look at this difference, that's the warning effect that we've been talking about. If you look at this difference, that's an implied truth effect, where you might suspect that if something doesn't have a label, but other things are labeled, you might believe this thing a little bit more. And what we find is that this is the case. It's smaller than the warning effect. But it is the case that unlabeled false headlines are perceived as a bit more accurate. We find this directionally, but non-significantly for sharing, which is a bit different than the original paper that came out. I think this makes a lot of sense if you think of accuracy as one component of why somebody might share something. We also look at heterogeneity across content plausibility. So on this plot, it's going to be similar to the ones I showed before, except now warning effects are going to be reversed, so that a higher positive warning effect isn't a backfire effect. It's just a warning effect on a flip scale, just to compare it to implied truth. What we find is warning effects are bigger for more plausible false content. Again, this is only 0.5 on a 0 to 1 scale of plausibility. So these are all the false claims. This is belief in the control condition. And then these are the absolute values of the effect sizes. Bigger warning effects for more plausible claims. And this is actually a significant quadratic relationship, and just a linear relationship is plotted out here. But essentially, bigger implied truth effects for these like more ambiguous false claims, and then smaller ones for more obvious and more strictly more plausible. And this is probably due to the fact that these ambiguous ones are where people might be using the additional like kind of heuristic of if the thing is labeled or not. I'll go with that to like kind of make my judgment. So we see a replication in terms of accuracy of this implied truth effect, but an important note here is that it's a lot smaller than the warning effect in general. But something that's really important that Daniel's question touched upon was, the coverage really matters here, which I think is one reason why doing stuff like crowdsourced fact checking can help supplement some of the coverage and assist these fact checking efforts just to get more content evaluated, because fact checkers numbers are small and take a lot of time to do these fact checks. And I'll just close with a quick thank you to collaborators, David Brand, Nick Stagnaro, who ran the multi-platform comparison study with myself, and other collaborators of mine in the Human Cooperation Lab. So thank you again. And yeah, happy to take more questions now. Just wanted to squeeze that little last bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameron. That was indeed interesting. Let's see if we have further questions, because there's still like more or less 5 minutes.
Perfect. Yeah.
So Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk.
Thank you.
Very interesting data. Now, the one thing I guess you didn't show us, unless I'm mistaken, is the absolute levels of sharing between the true and the false headlines. Can you comment on that? Did I miss that?
Oh, yes. Let's see. I can pull up a separate slide for that. Yeah, one moment. Basically, having trouble now. Here it is. Can you still see my screen?
No, not at the
No?
moment.
All right. Let me reshare. There it is. Okay. Cool. Sorry about that. Yeah. So these are some of the absolute values. So 0.5 is going to be the midpoint around here. This is just a median split on trust and fact checkers. This is going to be the warning effect that we see. This slight boost is the implied truth effect, and these are for accuracy. And we're going to see really a similar patterns overall, but like a smaller gap between true and false for sharing as well. Yeah.
Okay, so when you say accuracy here, you mean that's the person's of the accuracy.
That is the perceived accuracy.
Perceived accuracy, right.
So okay. This should be lower because these are false. These should be higher if they are true.
Okay, so why do the low and high differ for the true control? I mean, are people basically, this seems to say that people who are high in trusting fact checkers are already better at telling when something is true.
So we actually don't find a meta-analytic is going to be a difference in that because there is an overall increase in belief by the high trust and fact checker people. So if you look at the discernment, the difference between like this bar and this bar and this bar and that bar,
Is that the same? Is it the discernment is
yeah,
the
the
same?
discernment winds up being the same between high and low, and what you
Okay.
see is basically like an overall effect of just trusting the news more, which makes sense because trust and fact checks, there's a trust measure, there's probably some underlying like
Okay. Okay.
trait trust. So that's what we see there. And sorry, it took me a second to find this slide.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, totally.
I also have a question.
Mhm.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
So you had also a factor of congruency between like partisanship and the headlines themselves, right? So you had Republicans and Democrats reading Republican
That's
and
right.
Democrat. So I was wondering if anything came of that, because I feel like that whole issue of congruency or incongruency would like make all of these issues of trust even more pronounced.
Yes. So first order for warning effects themselves, we find greater warning effects for politically concordant than discordant headlines. This is in line with previous work on that. And this is what we find for a lot of interventions. And I think the reason there is just the baseline belief is way higher in concordant than discordant. And so the interventions there's just more room to go down in terms of belief of like misinformation for concordant claims. So that's promising that the warning effects, the warning labels are working for even stuff that's politically congenial. And then in terms of if this is moderating the trust and fact checkers moderation, we don't find evidence of this that three-way interaction in a supplementary analysis that we do. However, it could be the case that we're just underpowered to detect this three-way interaction, even with a fairly large sample size. So I take that with a grain of salt. But at least for the first order question of the effect itself, we see a greater effect for concordant claims.
Thank you.
Great question. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
So if no one else has a question, since you presented to us comparative data for different platforms, I saw there was a huge variance in MTurk compared to all of the other platforms. Does this speak to the reliability of the platform specifically, or is it a matter of lower sample for this specific one?
Yeah. So I'll just pull up a thing to look at real quick.
And which one? I saw you said Lucid in your other experiment. So why did you choose Lucid instead of Prolific, for example?
Yeah. Okay. So good question. So we had a bunch of different MTurks to look at. This MTurk here that I discussed sometimes looks a bit different. This is like essentially like base MTurk. Some of these other ones, this is Cloud Research, which is like a more cultivated panel. This is an MTurk panel that Rob Willer at Stanford has like kind of found people that reliably do surveys. So we kind of expected this MTurk to like have the most variability and people perhaps not being super attentive or various other issues. So that's what that was a good eye for that. Where that MTurk was often different. I think that's just like a lower quality sample in many regards. The reason why we use Lucid is that we can get nationally representative quota sampling there, perhaps a bit better sometimes than Prolific, although we also do use Prolific and found the nationally and Prolific's nationally representative option as well. Another reason why Lucid is nice, in my opinion, especially for social media research, is a trade-off about Lucid is that you see lower attention levels, so people will do worse on like slightly more sophisticated attention checks in general. Again, we're screening people out based on like CAPTCHAs and like click this button kind of filters at the beginning, so we have some baseline attention there. But I think oftentimes people aren't, professionalized survey takers or super attentive when they're on social media. So it's important, I think, to get a range of survey platform recruitment across these different attentiveness and professionalization of survey takers, just to see if these effects seem to generalize across platform, if you think they'll generalize to a social media platform, which is where we might care about something like this working. And so those were the decisions that went into like starting with Elucid and then expanding to all these different platforms. But yeah, definitely one takeaway so far from the multi-platform is that like just using out of the box MTurk, even with like the 95% hit rate return, probably seems to be giving the most variable results for some reason or another. My colleague is still working on putting together this whole multi-platform study, but once it's out, I'm sure it will be circulated widely and hopefully be really useful for researchers when figuring out where to get participants from.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we can wrap it up. We're pretty much on time here. And thank you very much again, Cameron, for joining us today. It was great. And thank you everyone else for joining too. So right now we have a professional development after this meeting, which is going to be led by our colleague Simon about stress management. So anyone is welcome to to stay, but if you have to go, that's totally fine, because this is particularly aimed at our third-year students. So bye-bye to everyone that has to leave. And thank you again, Cameron. Keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was thank you again for all the questions, and wonderful to talk about this stuff. And reach out and send me an email, chat, cmartel@mit.edu. Happy to talk about any of this stuff and more. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.